Well, welcome everyone. It is great to see you here. We're gonna meet a brilliant young scholar tonight to commemorate the legacy of our late Professor Walter G. Andrews. I'm Selim Kuru, as some of you may know, and I'm an associate professor in the Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures Department, formerly known as Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, a name change that was justified through an email to those who are lucky to be on our departmental listserv email list. If you're not on this list, our students and myself will be happy to take a note of your email and add you. Please note that this Saturday there is another major event. I will talk about this one in a bit. Turkey in Seattle, a digital humanities project organized and supervised by my dear colleague, Dr. Melike Yücel, who is hiding somewhere. She's here over there. You may find out about this coming event this Saturday and other math programs on our website and by being included on our email list so that you can receive an email ahead of time. Well, I have been a very lucky person in this life to meet brilliant people, one major one among them, Walter Andrews. Since the time we first exchanged letters and emails while I was still in Turkey in 1993, and then since I started my position at the University of Washington, Walter became a mentor, a teacher, a colleague, a collaborator. However, I think all these professional terms were trumped by friendship. Walter became a friend. And he always ended up being a friend with people he worked with. It is difficult to describe and difficult to replicate Walter's act on these grounds of working together, being friends forever. Walter was a calligrapher. You can see one of his early pieces he did for University of Washington representation in the Middle Eastern Studies Association's conferences. This one says like the knowledge is the highest of all ranks in Arabic, and he learned calligraphy by major calligraphers in Turkey when he was a student. He started working on it, and in fact at the entrance to our department you may see one of his large pieces done in 1969 when he first moved to Seattle, given to his dear friend Jerry Baccarat, who donated it to our department. But yes, Walter was a calligrapher, a woodworker, a flute player, a great hiker and biker, bicycle rider. All these made him a unique, maybe a strange scholar of Ottoman Turkish literature with a great talent for telling stories and writing. Nationally and internationally, academic institutions of Ottoman and Turkish studies carry his signature as one of the founders, like our department here. On the other hand, Walter was a very humble man and a very shy one, which might not be apparent if you heard him giving a talk or keeping his ground in front of questions about Ottoman literature, for example. His curiosity for and research and love of literature determined his approach to human experience in this world. He wasn't only an internationally recognized professor, but he was also a local leader. Beyond the students who attended his courses, his interest in, for example, combining technology and humanities created a long line of students working in very different projects. I can give as an example Svoboda Diaries project, which Walter has founded in 2012 and worked with until today 200 undergraduate and graduate students through only this one project among many. I should also add his lay ministry at the East Shore Unitarian Church, where he worked with young people, generations of them, for over 50 years. We lost Walter on May 31st, 2020, just when the COVID crisis was starting taking heat. He left us with the task of keeping the flame he started, which is a passion for collaborative learning as a way of personal development. And his works, we need to keep their flame burning as well, which are immensely readable, inquisitive, and innovative. They will continue to excite, entice, and produce many scholars, creating more friends through Ottoman and Turkish literature across the globe. The inception of Walter G. Andrews' Memorial Lecture Series is a natural one, not only to recognize Walter's contributions to the culture of our department, but also to remember him as a model human being in my mind, for me. And the choice of Dr. Michael Pifer as the first speaker in the series is another natural one, since Michael's work follows the path Walter has opened and expands on it. Michael Pifer was recently hired as the professor of Armenian language and culture at Walter's alma mater, University of Michigan. Michael's first book, Kindred Voices, A Literary History of Medieval Anatolia, published by Yale University Press last year, is a powerful work with its language, its synthesis of scholarship on various languages, Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Armenian, Greek, some Hebrew, yes, and its message about living together, creating together, which is all the more important in our times. Pifer in Kindred Voices works on possibilities of multilingual communal experience and translingual exchange of ideas, and brilliantly displays how communication through different languages has been prevalent throughout history to readers who may find it difficult to communicate in one language. Before I leave the ground to Michael, I would like to thank Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures Chair Professor Naomi Sokolov for her encouragement in establishing this series, and to Patrick Gibbs, former, unfortunately, MELC administrator. Among many awards Walter had received, there is one which was dear to him, 2016 Turkish American Cultural Association of Washington's Longtime Service Award. Takawa, abbreviation of the association, continues to be a major supporter of the Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures Department and the Turkish and Ottoman Studies program. I'd like to thank Takawa Director Tufan Erdinç, who is with us here. Of course, I am thankful to you all for being here, and I nudge you gently to remember MELC's Turkish and Ottoman Studies program when it is the season of giving, so that we will continue with many events like this talk series and continue to support our students and contribute to the diversity at UW and in Seattle. Last but not least, I would like to thank Andrew's family, whose generous support of our program continues, the program that Walter founded. Beyond that support, I am thankful to Walter's wife, dear Melinda Andrews, their daughter Pam Sheffield, and Walter and Melinda's grandchildren, two of them are here, for being with us tonight. Thank you all. Michael.
Thank you so much. I really want to begin by expressing my heartfelt gratitude to Salim, to the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures, to the family of Walter Andrews, and to all the staff and the really wonderful students who made my visit so hospitable and memorable. This is actually the first time I've traveled by myself since the start of the pandemic. And it's been a real delight having sort of spontaneous conversations again about poetry and getting to learn about your work as well. Today I have the honor of delivering the inaugural Walter G. Andrews Memorial Lecture, which is both a humbling and a daunting task, especially given Professor Andrews' legacy in shaping not only Ottoman literary studies, but also his impact on pre-modern literary studies more broadly. In the spirit of much of Professor Andrews' work, today my talk will focus on what I call the dialogic between languages, between ascetic systems, between religious cultures, and yes, between very different peoples, including speakers of Anatolian Turkish and of Middle Armenian, although sometimes those categories were not always so mutually exclusive. Before I can tell you a small part of this story, however, I want to mark this occasion by pulling back the curtain slightly and revealing a few of the points of departure that brought me to pre-modern Anatolia to begin with. At least one clarifying moment came to me when, as a graduate student many years ago, I first cracked open Walter Andrews' classic, The Age of Beloveds, Love and the Beloved in Early Modern Ottoman and European Culture and Society, which he co-authored with Mehmet Kalpaklı. I read this book sitting by the bank of Silver Lake in Michigan, preparing for my own preliminary exams one summer. And as I read, it seemed like the shoreline to either side of me was imperceptibly wriggling and shifting, expanding along with the horizons in my mind of what seemed possible to do with poetry in the historical field. I mention this here because even though those afternoons at Silver Lake were specific to me, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this experience was relatively common for scholars in my generation in Ottoman literary studies. What's telling, though, what's really telling, I think, is that this is also true for many scholars in cognate fields as well. I found that Persianist colleagues in my cohort are just as likely to cite The Age of Beloveds as a foundational text in their own intellectual development, as they are to cite, say, Paul Lesensky's classic Welcoming Fehani, or the late and great Franklin Lewis's work on Rumi, or virtually any of the many books written by Anne-Marie Schimmel. I myself am actually another example of this. As I consider my intellectual home base, or at least my own linguistic place of departure, to be in Armenian studies, which is more than just a little suggestive, I think, of how far these different fields have come in the 2 decades since this book has come out. We all hope, I think, on some level, to change our fields in even a small way. But truly few are those scholars who end up shaping fields that they were never really part of to begin with. Here's what I think was happening for those of us who didn't or didn't yet work on Ottoman Turkish poetry. The Age of Beloveds felt like an invitation to think poetry differently, or more accurately, to think history poetically, through the prism of literary production, and see what sorts of worlds were refracted back through that lens. Over the many years since that afternoon, I found myself drawn back to the terrain, the rich terrain, of Professor Andrews' scholarship on many occasions. From his work on different literary registers in Poetry's Voice, Society's Song, to his 1970 dissertation on Latifi, to his anthologies on Ottoman poetry. But tonight, I'd like to frame my talk with a relatively lesser read gem that I hope you'll go home and read if you're all interested in the problem or problematic of pre-modern world literature. Titled Other Selves, Other Poets, and the Other Literary History, an essay in 3 movements, this work in part centers a genre known as the nazire, or parallel poem, as the mainstream and not merely an offshoot in Ottoman literary history. This genre of poetry was basically dialogic in nature, as it entailed a kind of complex literary response to pre-existing literary works. And basically its mechanism was mimicking certain aspects of the style or the theme of those pre-existing poems in order to create new meaning out of them. They're response poems. Professor Andrews challenges readers to envision
a form of Ottoman literary history based on the logic of the parallel poem, in which meaning is made not merely by individual literary works, but rather in the spaces between those works. That is, in the suggestive space where poems leave open the possibility of being addressed, directly or indirectly, by other poems, and by other poets who are yet to emerge upon the stage. Tonight, I'd like to respond myself to Professor Andrews's call for doing other literary history by bringing to light a kind of responsiveness in the literary field that arguably extends beyond a single genre or a single language. I'll do so through a comparative reading of two poems that were in fact not direct responses to each other, but instead reacted to an overlapping set of circumstances in which both were produced. In the first part of my talk, I'll be diving into a tale from one of the earliest works of long-form Anatolian Turkish poetry. This story comes from Aşık Pasha's Garipname, which was written slightly after the start of the 14th century. And in the story, we're going to see there's an Armenian, a Turk, a Persian, and an Arab who have become unlikely travel companions and also companions in dialogue along the road. In the second part of my talk, I'll examine a work of vernacular or Middle Armenian poetry, also likely from the 14th century, composed not far from where Aşık Pasha lived, that depicts the fraught love affair between a Christian Armenian and a Muslim Turk. Both works were written in multi-ethnic and multilingual urban spaces, and in fact respond to those spaces in a literal and in a thematic way. They concern the encounter of dissimilar peoples who speak within the Macaronic text in their own tongues. Moreover, both works also aim to provoke different responses in their interpretive or reading communities, shedding light on a tessellated cultural landscape that was drawn together by a historical convergence of peoples and languages, and yet was also paradoxically drawn apart by incongruous desires and religious boundaries. In short, I'll be arguing that in the specific ways these works respond to difference within their multifarious societies, they are also indirectly and implicitly responding to each other, insofar as each aim to shape a widespread and multilingual conversation in Anatolia, which unfolded in no small part across the poetic sphere on how to best accommodate certain forms of difference, but not all forms of difference, as we shall soon see. And here in this slide, if you're curious, I just wanted to show you a visual kind of convergence in how poets were represented. And on the left, there's a tile ensemble of a lute player and musician and possibly also a poet from the Seljuk Palace Kiosk in Konya. And on the right, east of Anatolia, in the Armenian city of Ani, you have a very similar figure. And you kind of see there's sort of shared ways of conceptualizing what the poet looks like, what their physical comportment is like, how they dress, how they hold their instrument, and even where they sit, as both of these cities were sort of pulled into a Persianate sphere in unequal ways, we can say.
Without further ado, let's dive into the first part of my talk, which takes us to the story of four unlikely traveling companions in 14th century Kırşehir. Like much of medieval Anatolia, this region was an astonishingly diverse place, home to Turkmen, Armenians, Greeks, Mongols, Persians, and many others. Aşık Pasha, a prominent Sufi intellectual in this region, attempted to grapple with the heterogeneity of his community, while also struggling to impart Islamic teachings to potentially new audiences. He's primarily famous today for composing the Garipname, which is one of the earliest known long-form works, as I mentioned, written in Anatolian Turkish, around the year 1330. Its name means something like Book of the Strange, or Book of the Stranger. In a sense, Aşık Pasha's family were also strangers in Rome, or Rome, meaning the formerly Byzantine territories in Anatolia. He came from a prominent family whose infamy was already well established by his day. His grandfather was Baba Ilyas, an itinerant preacher from Khorasan, who had reportedly helped to foment a message of popular revolt against the Seljuk state. Something you probably shouldn't do if you want your legacy to have longevity. Whereas Baba Ilyas's message led to social upheaval, his grandson would take another path, putting down roots in the multi-ethnic and multi-religious region of Kırşehir. And in fact, I'd suggest that on a both formal and linguistic level, Aşık Pasha's masterwork, the Garipname, acknowledges that times had changed since his grandfather's days. This long-form poem thus attempts to impart different lessons about Islam to a Turkish-speaking audience through the Persianate didactic Masnavi form. That is, through short, interlocking tales told in rhyming couplets. This work is particularly famous for its explicit justifications of composing an Islamic book in Anatolian Turkish rather than in the prestige literary languages of, say, Arabic or Persian. As Aşık Pasha claims, he wrote his book to communicate with both an elite and initiated coterie of Turkish speakers, which perhaps also included Mongol soldiers in the region, as well as with a more general populace, imparting different religious lessons to both. Aşık Pasha's understanding of cultural and linguistic heterogeneity is also closely tied, I argue, to his defense of writing about Islam in the vernacular language of Anatolian Turkish. He was, as we shall see, a sensitive and nuanced reader of difference, though he hardly presents us with a celebration of multiculturalism for its own sake. In the literature of medieval Anatolia, not all boundaries between peoples were always impassable. But at the same time, not all differences were permeable either. The Garipname thus can help us to understand, from a pre-modern and emic point of view, why an awareness of difference mattered to poets like this one in a different way than it might matter to us. So, with that, let's dive into the Garipname's tale of four unlikely traveling companions. It begins like this. Listen, O you who desires meeting. Once, four people, travel companions by chance, set upon one road together. One of them was Arab, one Persian, one a Turk, and the other of these travelers was Armenian. They didn't know each other's languages, nor did they understand what each other said. Suddenly, as they were traveling together, the four discovered an akçe on the ground. And this means basically a little white thing. And as Rudy Lindner has observed, it's probably a reflection of the purity of the silver mines in Anatolia that the Mongols really helped to develop and exploit so well. They picked up the coin and kept going. Listen to what they did when they arrived there. In a city brimming with abundant blessings, these companions eventually unburdened themselves. Soon, at the rumbling of their stomachs, each recalled that silvery coin from the road. But this is only where their trouble begins. Their tongues were different, says the text, but what they desired was the same. Listen to what each one said. At first, the Arab spoke in his tongue. O companions, give me grapes. The Persian said, let's buy grapes with this. We'll sit and feast well upon them together. The Armenian said, I want to eat grapes. If you get grapes, let us buy red ones. The Turkmen said, fetch grapes and let us feast. Let us set aside this small talk. Each didn't know what the others said. One, hearing another's speech, didn't understand. In fact, this passage is dense with the same heteroglossia that the story thematizes. The Arab actually speaks in verse the Arabic language in the text. The Persian speaks New Persian. The Armenian speaks Middle Armenian or vernacular Armenian. And the Turkmen speaks Anatolian Turkish. Of course, for this speech to be possible, Aşık Pasha had to be familiar with these languages himself. But whereas he apparently embodied multiple worlds, our travelers were not so fortunate. Soon they rose to their feet and began to beat each other with heavy blows. People from the street, hearing the noise, came rushing to observe the fight. All of the travelers called out to the crowd. Only one person was able to perceive their inner states. God had bestowed knowledge of many tongues upon this man, and he realized what each desired immediately. He came forward and said, "Hey, don't fight. Have patience, fall not at each other's throats. Give me the coin, that I may satisfy you and fetch what you desire." He took the coin and went to the garden, where he sold that one object, purchasing grapes. When he brought the grapes, he placed them before all. They became a remedy for the affliction of all. And thus, the Arab, Persian, Armenian, and Turkmen were able to resume their companionable relationship, sitting and speaking and feasting with one another in harmony, thanks only to the intervention of a wise guide, a knower not merely of tongues, but of hearts, which in the final analysis in this text really means the same thing. In Ashik Pasha's hands, the shared object of their desire, of course, is God. The wise guide is not merely multilingual then, but rather is a crafty spiritual leader, much like Ashik Pasha himself, who can usher the diverse peoples of the world into essentially the same religious communal fabric. At the core of this vision of Islam, we find a performative message. The linguistic origin of this story, appropriately enough, was not Turkish. In fact, Ashik Pasha's entire tale is a response to, or a creative reinterpretation of, a story by the towering Persian poet Jalal ad-Din Rumi, who had died some 60 years prior, not far from Qarshayir, in the city of Konya. I would suggest that by transferring the story across languages, Ashik Pasha is enacting its argument. That is, that other languages, including Anatolian Turkish, are just as capable of revealing Islamic meanings as the prestige literary languages of Arabic and Persian, even if they might literally and linguistically do so in a different manner. One might therefore read the entire story as a parable about the emergence of Turkish literary culture in Anatolia at this moment in time. This becomes clearer when we examine Rumi's original tale in the Masnavi, which differs from Ashik Pasha's version in several key ways. In the Masnavi, Rumi depicts a Persian, a Turk, a Greek, and an Arab, or a Rumi and an Arab, who come across a single coin. In Rumi's telling, each traveler calls for grapes in his own tongue. Here's what he says. A man gave one coin to four people. One of them said, "I'll exchange this for a grape, anguri." Another one of them was an Arab, and he said, "La, I want inab, not an angur, oh swindler." The other one was a Turk, and he said, "Hey, that's mine. I don't want inab, I desire uzum." The last one, a Greek or a Rumi, which is kind of a plastic term, but he actually used a Greek word here, said, "Set aside this fuss. We want stuff. In dispute, those people started to brawl. They were heedless of the secret of names. The multilingualism in Rumi's tale is largely confined to a single word, grape. The rest is in Persian. Thus, in a literal manner, Ashik Pasha's story is more welcoming to the languages that it describes. But if the Garibname accommodates linguistic difference, so too do its characters treat each other in hospitable and familiar terms. And here it's useful to think about Ashik Pasha writing like one generation after, say, a figure like Rumi is doing his work in Konya. Rumi's companions are already at each other's throats, having barely declared their preference for grapes. In Ashik Pasha's version, their behavior is entirely different. Here the travelers share an assumption, entirely lacking in the Masnavi, that they will feast together, as they already had cultivated a relationship with one another on the road. They are Yoldash, fellow travelers, even though they speak different languages. These subtle differences multiply as the story progresses. Whereas in the Garibname, a sheikh, or a spiritual leader, appears, comes forward to purchase the grapes himself, The sheikh never actually appears in Rumi's telling. If a lord of secrets had been there, Rumi posits, a venerable man of 100 tongues, he would have reconciled them, commanding the absolute obedience of his audience. Then he would have said, with this single coin, I will purchase what you all desire. When you entrust your heart to me without deceit, this, your coin, will do much work. Your one coin shall satisfy 4 desires. 4 enemies shall become one in concord. The things each of you speak create conflict and separation. The things I speak bring harmony. So, be silent, all of you, be silent, until I become your tongue in conversation. Arguably, in Rumi's hands, the Arab, Persian, Greek, and Turk represent all those who cannot understand higher spiritual meaning in general. It's a heuristic. That is the speech of all those without a Muslim peer or guide or elder. Had a guide been present, he would have emerged as the sole authoritative voice and stopped this conflict. This is, in fact, the message of Rumi's tale. The guide's authority is from heaven and is absolute. In his unifying speech, which produces souls of the same heart, people attached to the outward forms of things are cleansed of their old ways. Ashik Pasha, of course, does not contradict this message, but he does amend it somewhat, placing an emphasis not only on the authority of the spiritual guide, but rather on the importance of accommodating difference in Islam and through Islam. Whereas Rumi's guide simply silences his audience, declaring that only the guide's speech brings unity, Ashik Pasha's peer, Sheikh, explains what such unity means at length. As he implies, the cause of strife was not linguistic difference, but rather it was the inability to understand and comprehend difference in the proper way. They're not reacting the right way to difference. Thus, he says, this story is a parable for the state of people in the world, as all people basically desire the same thing, which is to say, in this context, their creator. The light of all these eyes is from one sun, he explains. The vitality of all these peoples is from one emir. This is just as there may be 1,000 candles, but light is the same. Or how a myriad plants are sustained by the same water. Or how by the wind of one sea there are 1,000 waves. When the wind ceases, the sea remains. Consequently, he reports, although people are different in form, the seeker of jewels does not pay attention to this. The challenge then was not to speak in a manner that negated the linguistic density or ethnic differences in this region. Rather, it was to speak in a manner that acknowledged explicitly, responded to, but did not overstate difference within one's own community, even as one attempted to organize disparate peoples around a particular hermeneutic or interpretive framework, which in this case was rooted in a particular practice of Islam. In other words, although Ashik Pasha drew on Persianate literary models to compose his masterwork, he explicitly grants all languages access to an extra-linguistic, higher realm of Islamic meaning, secrets, in a highly performative manner. The broader implication, I'd suggest, is that within this schema, all languages occupy an essentially displaced position in relation to God. Anyone, be they Turk, Armenian, Persian, or Arab, could thus take part in the production or reception of a multilingual Islamic literary culture. It's a revolutionary idea. It's sort of quietly planned out in this city. True alterity in this light is not necessarily tied to culture, semiotics, ethnicity, or language. Its higher or spiritual meanings, that is, knowledge about Islam, in particular, episteme about Islam, is still accessible through each of these languages and forms or prisms. In this context, the difference that matters, which here means the difference between what is Islam and what is not Islam, is arguably both epistemic and religious in category. Ashik Pasha's aim in this performative display is clearly aligned with the broader aims of the Gharibname, to impart lessons about Islam to potentially unreached audiences, even in new or controversial ways. I'd be happy to go into this in more detail in the question and answer session, but here I'll just add that Ashik Pasha is hardly unique or alone in this practice of selectively accommodating and responding to certain forms of diversity. For instance, Sultan Balad, Rumi's son, did something very similar, and roughly the same period of time, when he composed his Rababname, or Book of the Rabbek, in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Greek, which likewise imparts lessons about Islam in each of those interlocking languages. For different reasons, so too did Armenian poets welcome Persian and Anatolian Turkish into their own verses, even as they mobilized those languages to shore up the religious boundaries of their own communities. And this marks, I think, a really telling irony in the literary production of Anatolia at this period in time. In this corpus of amazing poetry that performatively accommodates and seemingly even celebrates the existence of many languages and many points of view, we find a concomitant struggle to reassert one form of affiliation, usually a religious form of affiliation, over all others. So maybe they're playing a game of yes and, but it's yes and but. There are limits to it. I call this mode of responding to cultural and religious difference a measured hospitality, in which ascetic systems move across languages and audiences in freer ways necessarily than do religious doctrines, which of course also move. This fact can be easy to miss, however, if we limit our frame to Turkish and Persian language texts, which exhibit a remarkable inclusivity towards the languages and the voices of others, even as they do so to shore up the absolute spiritual authority of their authors. For example, hagiography, composed in Anatolian Turkish or Persian from this period, also does something very similar. Ashik Pasha's son would in fact claim that on the occasion of his father's death, not only Muslims, but also Armenians and Jews would join the funeral procession in mourning, as they all were reportedly drawn to his father's spiritual charisma and authority. So you can see like very different kinds of texts working together to produce this idea of multilingualism or multi-ethnicity, again, for a particular purpose, to reinforce the spiritual authority of the knower of hearts, the authors usually know these texts, or their family members. This picture begins to look more complicated, however, when we bring authors from different religious communities into the frame, allowing them also to respond to both the promise, and sometimes from their perspective, the risks of the provisional inclusiveness that Sufi figures like Ashik Pasha promoted. My second poem of the night therefore features many of the characteristics that we just observed in the Garib Name and in the Masnavi, dexterously weaving multiple languages into the same scripted world of its author. Moreover, this story also revolves around a dialogue between an Armenian and a Turkish speaker, exploring both the possibilities of kinship and also the communal tensions that emerge when the two encounter each other. This poem is largely written, however, not in Anatolian Turkish, but rather in Middle Armenian, or vernacular Armenian, which is a medieval register of the Armenian language that began to emerge slightly before the appearance of Anatolian Turkish literature. This poem likely dates to roughly the same period, and has been attributed to different Armenian poets, namely to Hovannes Yerzingadze, or Hovannes of Erzincan, and to Hovannes Tokuradze. It takes place, at least in part, in the city of Erzincan, or Erzincan, which was a node along the Silk Road that helped to pull the fringes of Anatolia and Armenia, where they bleed together, into a Persian cultural orbit to the east. In fact, we know that Armenians from this region actually read works of Persian poetry, such as Ferdowsi's Persian Shahnameh, which I'd be happy to talk about more if you're curious later. For now, like the city of Kırşehir, it perhaps suffices to say that the region of Erzincan was also multi-ethnic and multi-religious, which our poem adopts as one of its primary themes. What sets this poem apart, however, is a kind of anxiety that is mostly absent from what we find in Anatolian Turkish literature from this period. The Armenian kingdoms had basically collapsed following the waves of Seljuk migration and conquest in the mid-11th century. And in fact, the last kingdom of Armenia moved from its ancestral territory to the region of Cilicia on the fringes of the Mediterranean Sea. Consequently, during this period, clergy of the Armenian Church increasingly began to express their fears that the Armenian faithful, now located beyond the realm of any Armenian kingdom, were at risk of leaving the fold, as though lost in a restless sea of others. Our poem likewise takes up this concern, though in a different way than we find in theological texts or general encyclicals of the Armenian Church. This is how it begins. The day was Saturday, on the cusp of Sunday, and I was descending from the monastery on high, says a certain holiness. He could not know, as he swung his censer and read aloud from his psalter, that a stranger was about to change his life. For a time I was coming, for a time reading, that I may go and arrive by the midday hour. I came and was engulfed in such flame. I did not write, I did not read. Someone rode a gray stallion. She came and passed by, daring as a Mongol. She had eyes that would conquer Tabriz. Her eyebrows bore away my mind. She dropped an apple. I paid no heed. She dropped another. I stooped and picked it up. And here he switches languages in the text. Sen Müslüman, Mola Bezi, Ben Horones, Kashish Okli. What does your apple have to do with me? When Horones addresses Asha, the woman who would become his beloved in the poem, he does so in her language. You are Muslim, daughter of a mullah, he explains simply in Turkish. I am Horones, son of a priest. And then he switches back to Middle Armenian. What does your apple have to do with me? The poem is brimming with oppositions of many kinds. Between the monk and Asha, between his superiors and her father, the mullah, between Hovannes and his kin, who urge him not to associate with infidels, between Asha and her kin, who desire his conversion to Islam, between the Muslim and Christian communities in which both live, whose fault lines run deepest at the moment when convergence seems possible. In the end of the poem, Hovannes and Asha marry, binding their families together in a new, albeit contentious, network of kindred relations. Yet Asha's conversion to Christianity, which occurs really abruptly in the final stanza of the poem, and in fact in some copies of this poem it doesn't happen at all, would hardly resolve the manifold tensions that simmer between our protagonists and their communities. The multifaceted relationship between Hovannes and Asha, far from having little import, would seem to stir up lasting consequences for the city of Erzincan, touching the lives of mullahs, monks, and everyone in between. Herein lies, I think, the interesting irony. Hovannes' question, what does your apple have to do with me, is meant to keep opposite. His question draws her into a multilingual dialogue that informs the structure, if not the primary theme, of the poem. Strikingly, by speaking in Asha's language, Hovannes establishes a manner of communicating that is comprehensible to Armenian and to Turk alike. What's more, his knowledge of Turkish advances an implicit claim that the text doesn't really want to speak aloud. He is already part of her world, even before her intrusion into his. This relationship, moreover, cuts both ways. Asha also calls to him in her enticing voice, in both Turkish and Middle Armenian. Here you can see the Armenian script, and I'll read it to you here. This is inflected with the Armenian spelling of these words. Yoru yoru gavur ohli, götür bizde bu havsozu. Sen Hovannes kashish ohli, ben Müslüman bolla kızı. Zirar sinek, hoş gibi. This is what she says. Come along, infidel son. Drop the absurd talk with us. You are Hovannes, son of a priest. I am Muslim, daughter of mullah. Zirar sinek, hoş gibi. Let us love each other, Asha proposes at the end of her speech, talking directly in Middle Armenian, in Hovanes's mother tongue. Hoshkuling, she reassures him. It would be sweet. Her voice serves as a foil to his own, mirroring his code switching, even as she puts forth a counter proposal. Asha teases a union, in other words, that seems unthinkable, and yet in some ways is here. It's already arrived. Like Ashik Pasha's tale of the four travelers, the story of Hovanes and Asha belongs to a polyvocal and multi-religious world, made both legible and audible by these dialogical voices. In fact, this poem is littered with sundry poetic techniques, unhomed from any single language. An octosyllabic meter, common to both Armenian and Turkish poetry, runs through our lovers' dialogue, uniting their languages within the same rhythmic pattern. Most stanzas end in alternating blocks of monorhyme, A, 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 B, 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 a literary technique that Armenians had adapted directly from Arabic poetry several centuries prior. In contrast to Asha, who converts irrevocably to Christianity by the poem's ending, the language of the poem wanders freely across multiple cultural terrains, picking up loanwords from Arabic, Persian, and Turkish along the way. In other words, through the eyes of an Armenian and a Turk, we are invited to consider, as medieval audiences were invited to consider, the knotty problem of negotiating competing claims for one's affiliation. As this poem makes clear, different axes of belonging, religion, language, community, even poetics, were not bundled together uniformly, but instead could engage pre-modern audiences in different ways and to different ends at the same time. This poem, in other words, is also highly performative. It depicts the union between a Christian and a Muslim, but it also showcases an evolving set of relationships born across an array of languages and peoples that had recently given rise to new expressions of literary culture in this region. Hovanes, for his part, is sorely tempted by this proposal. He feels an undeniable attraction to Asha and to Asha's voice, which shares in the same underlying meter as does his own. Her voice, like his, is the product of many encounters and mixings, obliquely refracting the shared histories between multiple peoples in this region. Yet Hovanes and Asha cannot, and in fact never really could, act freely upon this attraction. The picture is more complicated, and not just because one is an Armenian and the other is ostensibly a Turk. In a sense, the poem is less about two star-crossed lovers and more about the societies in which they live. Gradually, these seemingly peripheral figures loom into view. First, Hovanes's mother, who knows trouble, comes forth to admonish her son. Here is Hovanes's mother, boy. She wears a cloak over sackcloth, wandering the monasteries above, promising incense and candles. And then his mother speaks in the text. Monks say, I have sinned, and lost. Deacons say, Lord have mercy. Perhaps he will gather his wits, and my Hovanes will return home. He uttered not one, Lord, I have sinned, only Allah and Shahidullah. Then all spoke this reply, Hovanes has no way out. Hey, Hovanes, my son, return home and say, I sinned. Your priest bellows there, Asha has fallen after him. What becomes clear in this communal back and forth is that these peripheral figures are actually not peripheral at all. They are central to the escalation and the resolution of his conflict. Love is not merely a family affair, and it never is, but was one that involves the monks, the deacons, and even the priests of Pairs and John, who each share in Hovanes's precarious situation. His mother therefore commands these clergymen to reaffirm their creed. Her message is simple. When the boundaries of the community are at stake, everyone is accountable, and all must speak words of repentance. Lord, I have sinned. Still, Hovanes does not give up so easy. He knows he should not consort with Muslims. And yet, having met Asha, his situation has also changed. Straight away, he pleads his case to his mother, appealing directly to their bonds of kinship. He knows he has done wrong, and therefore he asks her to pardon or to make halal, in his words, the milk that he nursed from her body as a babe. But he cannot repay this heavy debt, and his mother is not moved. The mere evocation of old kinship bonds and admission of fault are not enough for her. These bonds must not be dissolved, but renewed. Moreover, and most importantly, this renewal should come, she says, through the formal intervention of the Armenian Church. I'll bring you an Armenian daughter, she promises him, if only he would renounce Asha. I'll have you blessed a married priest, she says. Again, Hovhannes declines. There is none like Asha, who in his words possesses the tongue of a nightingale, bulbul, and the waist as slender as a frank's. This is basically the crux of the problem. Hovhannes has drunk his mother's milk, but he has also heard Asha's voice. He should not have done both. Now opposing claims compete for his affiliation, presenting divergent possibilities for living and belonging in this borderland region of medieval Rome. Hovhannes cannot simply return to the monastery as though sealed away from the worlds beyond his own. Nor, at this point, can the nascent literary cultures of medieval Anatolia be so easily disentangled from one another. Asha is also suggestive of this shift. In the hands of another poet, say Attar, she would probably serve as a simple heuristic, a kind of character that repeats in this sort of story. The empty vessel of Hovhannes' desire, who must test his faith but for a moment before his glorious restoration as a true Christian. However, in this context, the lover from another religion is not entirely other. She is known, she is a family, and she is a community, and her own kinship networks correspondingly assume a historical density in this poem. Asha even names her family members, one by one, as if to clarify herself to Hovhannes. They call my grandfather Mullah, she slyly tells him. My brother they call the city's watchman, Shahdah. And they call me Asha, and my sister Zuluta, and my mother Fatima, and my father they call Qadi Bola. Her family members similarly exert their wills, even to the point of corporal punishment upon Asha. She must heed reason, they tell her. The Armenian cannot defend her or offer her help, they tell her. Asha was sitting by the window, face in palm, weeping deeply. Today my father the Qadi beat me, saying, why do you love the son of an Armenian? Look for once with Hovhannes, deaf and ear, hasten in his coming. Asha's voice, and maybe everything that I have to say I boil from this. Asha's voice might beckon to others, resound with others, sound like others. But the origin of the voice, the body, is not so free. The individual and social body can be disciplined, made to bend in ways that voices so airy and shapeless often seem to resist. And so, in this poem that openly and performatively celebrates many voices, we again find a concomitant struggle to reassert one set of affiliations over all others. And of course, this has been my story all night. And so, only one option is left to Hovhannes. He mounts a final appeal, traveling to Erzincan to address Asha's elders and plead the case for her. He does so, however, in a somewhat unusual and even slightly comic manner. Mad Hovhannes, when he heard this, hit the road to Erzincan. His head uncovered, hat in hand, he went and stood before the Khan. He saluted the king. They swiftly received his salute. He seized the tail of the gray horse. He recited a poem to every hair. Hovhannes does not evoke the Quran or promise to become Muslim. Rather, he recites poems, hundreds and hundreds of monoline quatrains, known as qafas. And this is actually the Arabic word qafiyya for rhyme or rhyme scheme that becomes slightly mutated in Armenian to mean a genre of rhyming poetry. We have no idea what Hovhannes' qafas were about, but their content is also not so important here. What matters, instead, is that this recitation allows him to perform a kind of poetic madness before a potentially hostile environment and audience. In other words, through the recitation of poetry, Hovhannes establishes positionality that will inform his relationship with the Chum. This positionality carries a distinct message. Hovhannes is not a heretic with hidden bruises up his sleeve. He is, instead, a character that will be familiar to his audience. He's the love-struck madman, willing to transgress any boundary to reach the hem of his beloved skirt. In this strictly literary realm, his transgressions are not only forgivable, but they're necessary. After all, the protagonists of such stories must journey down the path of crookedness, where boundaries dissolve like the mid-morning dew, only to arrive safely back at the shores of orthodoxy at the end. Hovhannes is only able to state this position and lay claim to Asha's hand by co-opting and speaking in his poetic language and comportment for himself. Poetry provides him with the language for expressing this effective state, but it also provides him with the leverage to insert himself into this new community. In speaking this way, he establishes. Soon after this performance, the story comes to an end. Asha commands Hovhannes to enter the mosque and promenade in the laws. He counters by lamenting that he's forgotten the Psalms. She finally consoles him by promising, at last, to become a Christian. Order and orthodoxy are restored. Yet the simplicity of this ending, I think, belies a more complicated reality. The poem, like much of Anatolia during this brief period in time, exists in an in-between state, in which multiple and mutually exclusive outcomes seem equally possible and valid to the people who are creating and consuming these kinds of works. The narrative teeters in superposition between Hovhannes' potential conversion to Islam and Asha's potential conversion to Christianity. Eventually, however, like all moments, this one ends. The box opens and the wave function collapses. A choice must be made, and this choice, like all choices, bears consequences for the individual and community alike. Of course, at this moment in pre-modern Rome, it was not entirely clear what direction the arc of history was going to take. These poems, then, are hardly aesthetic niceties or neutral actors upon the stage. Rather, they seek to nudge the outcome in this way or that, bending the arc of history, as it were, the eventual conversions that will take place in Anatolia, in the direction that they see fit. Here I wish to take a large step backwards and take a broader view at this inter-networked literary landscape that I've just been teasingly mapping for you. It is probably safe to say that the story of Hovhannes and Asha is not a direct response to Ashik Pasha's story of the four unlikely traveling companions. At the same time, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to figuratively label these two poems produced under similar circumstances at roughly the same period in history as essentially Asha's invitation on the one hand and Hovhannes' response on the other. Ashik Pasha, in a performative blend of theory and praxis, invites his audiences to reveal Islamic meaning from their own sociolinguistic positionalities, because higher spiritual meaning, the truth about Islam, is the domain of no single people or culture in his argument. Of course, for Ashik Pasha, that meaning must also always point back towards Islam, or what Shahab Ahmed would call the pretext, the context, and the text of the revelation of the prophet. The story of Hovhannes and Asha, for its part, takes this invitation extremely seriously. Hovhannes takes on the mantle of the love-struck madman, ready to throw away everything for his beloved, which is a common motif in Islamic literature. Yet he also slyly acknowledges that he is thoroughly enmeshed in Asha's world even before the two meet. Hence, his knowledge of Anatolian Turkish mirroring her knowledge of Middle Armenian. His attraction to her is serious, and his community takes it seriously, attempting to bring the lovers back into line and forcibly restore the confessional boundaries of the Armenian Church. In other words, although these poems are not speaking directly to one another, they are still speaking to potentially overlapping audiences, as it were. In fact, they both hope to win over. Moreover, they do so using the potential languages of those audiences, borrowing from remarkably similar literary devices. And to make this picture even more complicated, they are hardly the only interlocutors on the scene. Ashik Pasha is also speaking, for instance, to the Persian poet Rumi. Armenians in Erzincan, similarly, were also connected to a Persian sphere. And in one dazzling example of poetic adaptation, they even end up rewriting the Shahnameh in Middle Armenian, if you'd like to know more about that later. So too did Rumi's son, Sultan Balad, dispatch followers to Erzincan to spread his father's teachings and poetry. Finally, of course, on the fringes of this conversation are also speakers of Syriac and Greek, Ladino and Latin, Arabic and Classical Armenian, and many others. It is a landscape full of voices, and my own ears can only hear so many. Perhaps yours can hear farther, or at least can hear differently than mine. By way of conclusion, here I want to return to Professor Andrews' notion of the other literary history with which I began. For Andrews, this other literary history begins by foregrounding a particular genre, nazira, meaning a parallel or response poem, as the mainstream, essentially upending the idea that literary production is a static and stable affair in which texts are handed down wholesale through the ages for safekeeping by posterity. Or another way of putting this is that his vision of the other literary history centers a kind of literary praxis in which responsiveness and dialogue between poets is actually the main protagonist of the story. This understanding views literary history as shaped by a kind of dynamic push and pull. The implicit and explicit dialogues between many interlocutors across language and time, and not one that is subsumed by a kind of Harold Bloomian anxiety of influence. The anxieties here are different. They're not over-adaptation or imitation. What I'd like to suggest here, of course, is that we take Professor Andrews' site as an invitation that potentially extends beyond, again, one single genre or even language. A gentle nudge to begin mapping the dialogic and multilingual literary field in new and different ways. Or to riff on some familiar wordplay, we might also call this other literary history the other Bakhtinian heteroglossia, mapped not only across class and registers of speech, but also across a restless multilingual landscape, one that draws together speech beats that are too often disarticulated from one another along the contemporary fault lines of knowledge production in the contemporary university system. Professor Andrews says something to this effect in a lovely and elliptical way. Observing that the Ottoman literary landscape does not always conform to the expectations of modern readers in Western and Anglophone societies, he writes, and I quote, "The fragmentedness of Ottoman poetry, which has a resemblance to the, from our perspective, fragmentedness of the Ottoman collective self, becomes problematic for us because we are inclined to look at the poem as a unitary text or object, rather than as an interaction between texts." End quote. We ought to extend this observation to encompass a more expansive, unruly understanding of the Anatolian literary field. Not a series of separate but ostensibly equal literary canons, but rather an ongoing conversation in which, for a brief and fraught moment in history, it seemed no one would have the final word. Thank you.
Now, before fielding, like opening the field to questions, I have a question to start with. Like, first of all, like, this is a fascinating comparison of two different, different kind of texts. Very different genres, very different languages, and different tactiques of using multiple languages in text. In Armenian case, it's very both are integral, but there are more languages, brief story, a longer story, etc. And you tie all this to a specific period and a specific land.
Well, it's useful. The period is maybe specific. That can't be done away with. Because it is this sort of early moment when Turkish is entered into Anatolia. And by Anatolian Turkish, I kind of just mean any Turkish that appears within the geographic peninsula of Anatolia, because it's heterogeneous and unstandardized and so much going on. And Middle Armenian is also emerging just slightly before this in this same geography. The geographic container, it's the story could go all the way into the Persian sphere, it could go into Central Asia, it could go in many ways. And I hope that someone will take it there. But yeah, just for the purposes of this project, I found there's so much to do, even with this sort of small geographic space, that becomes convenient. Well, hopefully, if anyone reads the book or listens to this tonight, it's also sort of an invitation to pick out where any single scholar is really limited for what they can accomplish. But was that what we're going to ask, or did I?
No, but
Yeah, okay.
it's really good answer, so I take it.
Please go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about such instances might have happened. Like I remember Seyfettin's story, which incorporated Armenian in Ottoman script. I have told you the anecdote, like I don't understand this line, but it's an Armenian sentence, etc. So it was interesting how can we step back from this particular case and look at the wider global literature, looking at certain texts, maybe in Latin America, incorporating native languages. Can it be a perspective, theory, how to call such an approach is kind of a...
I see. Okay, yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't have a single answer for it. I think that, I think just my own trying to work through this region and what's so complicated about it. Think about like what holds it together as a literary field, if we can call it that. The fact that they're reading each other's stuff, or they're at least responding to audiences, or potentially going over to the other side, or multiple other sides, creates a kind of tension that holds the literary field together. And so, again, thinking about accommodation as something that doesn't produce language utopia, but in fact, the proliferation or the spread of certain literary devices or forms or something actually becomes the heated new battleground for fighting these wars, basically, which in Anatolia kind of look like confessional battles. But maybe elsewhere, they look like other kind of battles.
Yes.
They're like, it's this weird irony in, again, the global diffusion of literary forms that it becomes a baseline for creating a new form of differentiation, even within an increasing kind of sameness that occurs. I was talking about this earlier today when I was talking with students, but we can think about translation as a useful framework for tying together, transnational spaces or languages as a contact point between languages. But often there's a lot of movement happening. It's not the movement of wholesale text circulating, or what we think of as proper translation today. It's like this partial response to one little aspect of something else, but not to the rest. It's a sort of being willing, I think, to shatter our categories in the literary field, and instead just see what exists there. It is a useful starting point for tracing trajectories that translation proper doesn't look at, or that world literature's idea of it's the text that moves beyond its point of origin. We're not dealing with texts that move exactly, but smaller parts of them sometimes. Thank you.
We can get a few questions. There's time. Yes.
I was wondering with the great story, whether in Pasha's or Ruben's earlier version or any of the spontaneous poetry version of the story, if the different names for the grapes or God were taken as different names for God between Muslims and Jews and Christians, if this kind of moral was sometimes not just language divisions, within the Muslim community, but between religions, if that was a present ideology in this era.
Okay, so just to make sure I understand, you're asking if we could read the stories, not just talk about language's capacity to reveal Islamic meaning, but as metaphors for different religious communities to reveal Islamic meaning or some kind of meaning differential.
Yeah, or perceived differences and how they do it and talk about it, but ultimately the same design or purpose.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in the case of Rumi, maybe it's a little easier to answer because hagiographies written about Rumi are a lot longer, there's a lot in them. And there's lots of stories in, Aflaki's The Feats of the Knowers of God that involve Rumi interacting with Armenians or with Jews or different religious communities and basically saying, it's the best if you become a Muslim, but if you can't become a Muslim, that's fine. If you need to cling to Jesus, that's fine. You can still learn how to renounce some of your attachments, the things that are causing you harm. So there is kind of an accommodation that's present that makes room for living with certain forms of difference. And of course, also in the same text, this is why I got to take it with a grain of salt. The text claimed, well, actually, he did win over those communities. Like the Christians and the Jews came out when he died, and the Christians said he was the Jesus of our age, and Jewish people said he was the Moses of the epoch, and we understood our Torah through him. So the stories come from the same text. So on one hand, it seems like there's some kind of latitude for allowing for non-conversion to take place. And on the other hand, the same text will walk that back and say, well, actually, Rumi has authority because he's able to attract different people who are not Muslims to him. That's the true marker. He actually really can reveal Islamic meaning everywhere and anywhere. I think accommodations and I hate this term, but like tolerance is a very lukewarm modern value to tolerate someone else's life or existence. It can be tempting to read that into some of these texts, and in some cases there's certainly ambiguity that's there. But I think sometimes the boundaries, the confessional religious boundaries, are harder than certain traditions of scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you for this amazing book, Michael. I would like to hear a bit more of your interpretation of this mother's milk and Pasha's voice, because it looks like there is this body and soul reconciling, but can you tell us a bit more about it? How do you read them?
Yeah, I can try. Yeah, thank you. Drinking someone's milk is absolutely a way of establishing kinship, whether it's your biological mother or not. That's why you become mom. You are forbidden from having a certain relationship with somebody through, drinking milk or something else. So the way that I read it, and I'm curious if you read it in a different way, is simply that, Holiness is asking to dissolve that kinship tie. He can't have them both, and he kind of is implicitly acknowledging it. And he's doing it in kind of, at least the text is doing it, in maybe a sly kind of way, because it's using an Arabic word to ask for the dissolution of these bonds, saying make it halal in our interchangeable verb. And so I think that, and again, it kind of, well, at least in my opinion, it goes back to this question of you can have multiple languages, you can have multiple cultures, you can be part of all these different sort of musical and poetic communities, but in the end, you have to pick a side. You can't have multiple kinship networks without changing them so completely from what they originally were. And that's the thing, at least in these Armenian texts, these authors are writing beyond the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia. They're kind of in like a precarious sort of situation, and they come down hard, at least in the stuff that we have written, which is mostly by clergymen, on the other side of we must reject the invitation. But if you have a different reading, I'd like to talk to you later now.
I have to think about it, but I think we can talk more about it.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other question? There's one.
Thank you for a really terrific talk. I'm standing up because I can't project very well.
No, thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in how you think about the consequences of conversion.
Mhm.
And you mentioned one possible alternative of Hovannes being tempted, but then returning to the fold, and maybe that being a symbol of, a higher spiritual authority that Armenian Christianity might hold in the poem. And then in the poem that you chose to share with us, a Muslim girl converts. I'm curious how you see, the spiritual authority that seems to hold within that poem, or the impact that it's supposed to have in the spiritual realm, but also maybe in the political realm. I was curious about what consequences might come of a Muslim girl converting to Christianity. I don't know to what extent you have evidence about this, or to what extent other poems talk about this, but I'm curious about the spiritual realm and the political realm, and what consequences might be feared, for example, if a conversion were to happen.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I have a great answer for it, but at least in these sort of poetic texts that I look at, I think often conversion is teased. It's a kind of translation, you're translated into a new confessional community, so you do have to renounce your mother and helper, you have to give up something to do it. But you also see in different sorts of texts, like in Chronicles, the elite are not always playing by the same rules as people on the ground in the Armenian church, or maybe charismatic Sufi leaders are fighting over. And they can convert sometimes as though there weren't much consequences for the action, in a sort of very pragmatic, perhaps, way of, you marry another family, you might convert, you might not, or it's ambiguous what happens to you. So I think that maybe my cop-out answer is there's a spectrum of things that happen when you convert, depending on who you are. And sometimes, like in the Rumi story of conversion seems like it's permissible not to do. It's just simply ambiguous and just sort of sits there. And I'm totally not sure what to do with it either. I think maybe part of it reflects an understanding that, okay, maybe you're not going to win over all the hearts and minds, but you can still have a kind of spiritual charisma or legibility in your community, even if people aren't exactly following the creed. And as it relates to politics, I don't talk about this very much, but of course, eventually Rumi's family is being patronized in a way by the Ilkhanate. And then Sultan Balad writes praise poems, about these sovereigns. So they also kind of accrue a sort of spiritual authority by attracting, certain kinds of learned Persian speakers from Khorasan to come live in backwaters of Anatolia. So, if you patronize the guy who knows the most languages and can attract the most people around him, even if they're not all converting, it's this sort of, again, communal performance of different kinds of power and different people reading different things out of performance. And maybe we can say the same thing about conversion itself. It's a really interesting question, and I'd have to think about it.
You can take one more question. There's none I will ask. Last question.
Maybe, whatever, maybe something you're just curious about, something I say.
Oh, thank you.
Again, this is really fantastic. I really enjoyed this. In the case of Hovannes and Asha, it seems like Hovannes is faced with this big problem. Do I go with my mother's milk or with the voice of my beloved? And then it seems like in the end, it's all rendered moot by the fact that the actor is not him, but Asha, who ends up converted, unless I heard that incorrectly.
No, you're right.
And so I'm wondering, it seems like in that story, the main tension is solved by someone who is not, who is it is sort of in the middle of the tension, but it seems like Oban's is kind of the main character and is not the one who actually resolves things. So I was wondering how that sort of tension is solved in like other poems of a similar style that you've seen, because that one seems to be like, it almost seems like there was like, it was.
Yeah, that's a great observation. It is the easy way out. I actually don't like the ending of this poem very much. Because it like sort of, it's a very literary response to this. It's like, you know what, I might as well just flip this light switch, the problems will go away. This whole tension of him slowly unpacking, like it just fades away. And that's why I kind of alluded to, there are some versions of this manuscript where they don't have a conclusion. Asha doesn't convert, ONS doesn't convert, everyone hates each other, and it's just left in this state of suspension, eternal suspension. And to me, like it's both fascinating that there were readers of the poem at this period in time that maybe preferred that ending, or were at least okay with that ending, as maybe reflecting something, I don't know, reading into it, perhaps more real to them. They actually are all living in this state of suspension, where the outcome is not totally certain, and it's, depending on who you are, it's either terrifying or something that appears very promising, an opportunity to accrue a kind of power or authority or a leg up on other communities maybe. In terms of other poems, these are two that I looked at that really explicitly bring multilingual dialogue into the fold. But there's like a wide range of different sorts of ways of incorporating other languages into these texts. And one really interesting example comes from a manuscript that I showed you here. Go back. Okay, this one. No. Sorry. Okay. It comes from this manuscript. This on the right, this is a Middle Armenian manuscript that records many of the poems by this really enigmatic Armenian figure, Freak, who was one of the earliest that we know of, who's writing poetry in Middle or Vernacular Armenian, which again is like not so different, from classical Armenian to say like Latin and Italian or something. But Middle Armenian is a language that's full of all kinds of loanwords from its adjacent cultures and interfaces with them. And in the poem, at the top, this is Armeno-Persian at the very top here. So it's Persian in the Armenian script. And it's actually a poem that would seem to describe a certain kind of Sufi experience, the annihilation of the self, in your sort of pursuit of true love of the Creator or God. Below it is written a really tight translation into Middle Armenian, almost word for word, except at the end it just sort of slightly switches some of the key terms. Instead of saying, you're going to be slaughtered for give up yourself in the kitchen of love, it says you're going to be slaughtered on the holy altar. So it slightly tweaks it to make it more Christian. And then at the very bottom, there's a whole commentary explaining how this is about Christianity, and we're all going to be judged eventually, and there's a big daftar in heaven, they're writing all this stuff we're doing down, so watch out. And basically what I think is interesting is kind of like in the ONS and Asha poem, where there is no ending. Things are just allowed to stay in a state of suspension where multiple things seem possible. They leave the original Islamic Persian poem there, untouched. So why would they do that? And I think that one answer, at least for me, is that the clergymen and the religious figures who are writing down all these texts that we have today are implicitly acknowledging that they're not really in total control of the things that their audiences are listening to and hearing and consuming. And so what do? Well, if you can't prevent someone from listening to the Shahnameh, go write an Armenian Christian Shahnameh. Try to compete in some way, replace it in some way. Teach people to see the Islamic poem through Christian eyes. So they can't translate it literally, they can't stop people's ears from hearing these sounds, but they can maybe create a space in people's heads where translation does take place. And you can be a Christian and listen to an Islamic poem, or perhaps vice versa. So I think there's again, there's interesting spaces that emerge when you see different languages entering into these texts. That again, you try to hang on to this rare moment when, again, no one has the final word on what's going to happen.
I think at this point, I thank you. It was a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
A lot to talk about it. We can chat at the corridor, etc. We need to enter the room in 5 minutes, but thank you for coming. Good night to everyone.